What's going on guys, Jin here. This is my take on a Hydra build. I used Hydra and Fireball to level up actually, and it was really quick, so I figured I'd revisit its endgame form here. I'm going to be covering the standard non-mythic version in this video, but the build planner will have the mythic and non-unique versions included as well. The normal build can clear up to tier 110 pits and tier 7 hordes, and the mythic version can do up to 125 tier pits and tier 8 hordes. Before we get into it, if you like builds laid out simply like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the bell and leave a comment if you'd like. It helps out a lot and I really appreciate it. Thank you, and now to the build. So for the skill tree, we're going to start off with 2 into Firebolt. Then in our core skills, we're going to take 2 into Frozen Orb and go for the Greater Frozen Orb. Then in our defensive skills, we're taking 1 into Flame Shield, 1 into Teleport, and go for the Shimmering Teleport. We're also taking 3 into Glass Cannon, 1 into Elemental Attunement, 1 into Ice Armor, and go for the Shimmering Ice Armor. Now in our Conjuration skills, we're taking 5 into Hydra, and going for the Summoned Hydra. Then we're taking 1 into Ice Blades, going for Summoned Ice Blades. 1 into Lightning Spear, with Invoked Lightning Spear. 3 into Conjuration Mastery. 1 into Align the Elements. And 3 into Mana Shield and Protection. In our Mastery skills, we're taking 3 into Inner Flames, and 3 into Devouring Blaze. Then in our ultimate skills, we're taking 1 into Permafrost, 3 into Hoarfrost, 1 into Fiery Surge, 3 into Soulfire, and 3 into Endless Pyre. Then for our key passives, we're going to be taking Combustion. As for our enchantments, we're going to be taking Frozen Orb as our first enchantment, so whenever we cast a non-basic skill, we have a 30% chance to launch a Frozen Orb at a nearby enemy. And for our second enchantment, we're going to be taking the Ice Blades enchantment, so for every 40 seconds in cooldowns we spend, we spawn an Ice Blades on a random enemy. Pretty straightforward there. Now for the Paragon board. So in the starting board, we're going to go for Elementalist as our glyph. So dealing fire, cold or lightning damage to an enemy increases all damage we deal to them by 5% for 10 seconds, stacking once per element. Our second board, we're going for the Enchantment Master board, and then we're going to put in the Unleash glyph here. So after spending 50 mana, we deal 8% increased damage and gain 25% increased mana regen for 3 seconds. For our third board, we're going for the Burning Instinct board, making sure we take the node. So our burning damage is increased by 10% of our critical strike damage bonus, plus 1% for every 20 intelligence we have up to 80%, and as you can see we have 80%. For the glyph, we're going to be using the Tactician glyph here, so we deal 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill. This duration is increased by 4 seconds for each defensive skill not on the action bar. For our fourth board, we're going up here to our Frigid Fate board, making sure we take the Legendary node as well. So we deal bonus damage to vulnerable enemies equal to 20% of the total amount of our bonus damage with cold, up to 60%, which we also have. And for the glyph, we're using Conjurer, so we get a bunch of Conjuration damage here, and Conjuration skills have 20% increased duration. For our fifth board, we're going to go for the Searing Heat board, making sure we take the node again, so Pyromancy skills have 12% increased critical strike chance, and deal direct damage equal to 20% of our damage with fire bonus, up to 60%, which we have. And for the glyph, we're going to be using the Exploit glyph here. So we get a bunch of vulnerable damage, and dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases our damage by 1% for 6 seconds, up to 10%. Then for our sixth board, we're going back down to our Burning Instinct board with the Tactician glyph, and underneath there we will have the Elemental Summoner board. So we make sure we take the Legendary node. Our Conjuration skills have 10% reduced cooldown on mana cost. They also deal bonus damage equal to 10% of the total amount of our bonus damage of Fire, Lightning and Cold, up to 60%. As for the glyph, we're going to be using the Enchanter glyph here, so we get a bunch of non-physical damage, and for each skill equipped in our enchantment slots, gain 5% maximum resistance to that skill's element. And last but not least, we go all the way back up to our Searing Heat board with the Exploit glyph, and above that we will put in the Ceaseless Conduit board, so this will be our 7th board, and we're going to put in the Destruction glyph here. So that gives us our critical strike damage, and critical strikes increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, up to 12%. So that is the Paragon board. All of this will be in the build planner in the description below, so make sure you check that out if you want to go at your own pace. So next up we have the gear. So for the gear on the left, I'll list the masterworking you want, as well as the affixes and the tempering. So let's start with the helm. We're going to go for a Godslayer crown here. That gives us all stats, max life, damage to elites, and cooldown reduction. Also, when we stun, freeze, or immobilize an elite, we pull in all nearby enemies and deal 30 to 60% increased damage to them for 3 seconds, and this occurs once every 12 seconds. Against bosses, this effect triggers when dealing damage instead. So we really want one of these, and for the masterworking, we're going to masterwork the cooldown reduction. If you don't have access to a Godslayer crown, you would want to use a helm with cooldown reduction, intelligence, and max life. You would temper that with warmth, and lucky hit percent to immobilize. As for the masterworking, you would masterwork the cooldown reduction. And for the aspect, you would want to use something like Everliving, so you take 10 to 25% less damage from crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. Next up, we have the chest piece. We're just using a normal chest piece here with intelligence, armor, and ranks 2 defensive skills. We're going to look to temper that with warmth and lucky hit percent chance to stun. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the intelligence if you have a greater affix on armor. If not, then masterwork the armor twice and the intelligence once. As for the aspect, we're going to use the aspect of concentration, so casting a conjuration skill grants us 15 to 25% damage reduction for 5 seconds. Next up we have the gloves. We're going to be using normal gloves with intelligence, attack speed, and critical strike chance. And we're going to temper that with Hydra damage and lucky hit percent chance to freeze. As for the masterworking, masterwork that attack speed. For the aspect, we're going to go for Shredding Blades here, so Ice Blade's chance to apply vulnerable is increased by 20%, and the duration is increased by 4 seconds. You gain 15 to 30% vulnerable damage as well. Next up we have the pants. We're going for Tyrael's Will. That's going to give us all stats, max life, max resource, and damage reduction whilst unstoppable. We also deal 10 to 20% increased damage whilst unstoppable and for 5 seconds after. When you become unstoppable, you also gain 50 primary resource. And we're going to try and get the masterworking on the damage reduction whilst unstoppable, or the max life. If you don't have access to Tyrael's Will, you would use some normal pants with intelligence, max life, and armor, temper that with warmth and crowd control duration, and masterwork the intelligence. As for the aspect, you would use the aspect of Snow Veiled, so casting ice armor will make you unstoppable, and grant 25% damage reduction for 3.5 to 5 seconds. Next up we have the boots. We're going to go for Esu's Heirloom here. That gives us movement speed for 7 seconds after killing an elite, critical strike damage, and resistance to all elements. Also, our critical strike chance is increased by 20 to 40% of our movement speed bonus. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the critical strike damage. If you don't have Esu's Heirloom, use some normal boots with intelligence, movement speed, and max life. Temper that with evade cooldown reduction and crowd control duration. For the masterworking, you would masterwork the intelligence, and for the aspect, you would use the aspect of Metamorphosis here. So when you evade, you turn into a cloud of bats, becoming unstoppable for 2.5 seconds. Enemies along your path also take physical damage and are inflicted with Vampiric Curse, and evade's cooldown will be increased by 10 to 5 seconds. And of course you're looking for the low roll there. As for the implicit affix on the boots, you would try and get the attacks reduce evade's cooldown. Next up we have the weapon. We're going for a staff here, two-hander, and we're going to try and get intelligence, vulnerable damage, and maximum life. And for the tempering, we're going to temper that with Hydra damage, and casted Hydras have +2 to their heads. And for the masterworking, you're going to try and masterwork the casted Hydra heads. For the aspect, you're going to go for the Stormswell aspect here, so we will deal 30 to 60% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. And we're putting this on the staff to get the 200% bonus. Next up we have the Amulet. We're going for the Fractured Winterglass here. This is going to give us a lot of non-physical damage, chance for Frozen Orb projectiles to cast twice, conjuration cooldowns are reduced by 0.2 to 0.4 seconds when a Frozen Orb explodes, and ranks into Conjuration Mastery. Also, casting a Frozen Orb has a 35 to 65% chance to spawn a random conjuration when it explodes, and on lucky hit, your conjurations have up to a 50 to 90% chance to launch a Frozen Orb at nearby enemies. So really good amulet here, synergizes well with the build, and is one of the key components. For the masterworking, you're going to try and masterwork the Conjuration Mastery. If you don't have access to a Fractured Winterglass, you would want to use a normal amulet with Conjuration Mastery, attack speed, and cooldown reduction. You would temper that with Hydra damage and Ice Blade's cooldown reduction. You would want to masterwork the Conjuration Mastery, and for the aspect, you would want to transfer the aspect of Shredding Blades onto your amulet, as you would get the 150% bonus. And on the gloves, instead of using the Shredding Blades, you could use something like Frozen Orbit. So Frozen Orb explodes 2 additional times at its destination for 45 to 60% of its damage. Or you could use something like Serpentine, so you may have 1 additional Hydra active, and Hydra's duration is also increased by 10 to 25%. Next up we have the rings. Swap those. For our first ring, we're going to be using our Tyrael's Iridescent Loop. That gives us lucky hit chance, non-physical damage and cooldown reduction, as well as ranks into potent warding. Also, for each type of elemental damage we deal, gain 10 to 20% increased damage for 4 seconds, up to 40 to 80%, and dealing any elemental damage refreshes all bonuses. So really strong ring obviously, and for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the cooldown reduction. For our second ring, we're going to be looking for a ring with critical strike chance, attack speed, and vulnerable damage, and we're going to temper that with Hydra damage and Ice Blade's cooldown reduction if possible. For the masterworking, you want to try and masterwork the attack speed, and for the aspect, you're going to be going for Conceited here, so you deal 10 to 25% increased damage while you have a barrier active. If you don't have access to Tyrael's ring, then you would use a duplicate of this secondary ring here, with the exact same affixes, and for the aspect, you would use something like Frozen Orbit. So that pretty much wraps it up for the gear. For the gems, we're going to be using 2 skulls in the jewellery, and 1 diamond. For the weapon, we're going to be using sapphires, 2 of them. And for the armor, you can either use topazes or rubies. I've got a mixture of both. Topazes if you want more damage, rubies if you want more survivability and max life. So that's all for the build. Thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed the video or made it this far, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, as it really helps out the channel a lot. Leave a comment if you want to as well. I really appreciate it. So thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video. I'll leave you with some more Hydra action. Bye!